The man walked along the snowy trail on a cold, gray day. The ground was covered in pure white snow and ice, stretching as far as he could see. This was his first winter in Alaska. He wore heavy clothes and fur boots, but the cold still bit through, making him uncomfortable. He was heading to a camp near Henderson Creek, where his friends were waiting. He expected to reach there by 6 in the evening, just as darkness would settle. His friends would have a fire burning and hot food ready for him. A big gray dog followed behind him. It was half dog, half wolf, and it did not like the extreme cold. Unlike the man, the dog understood that it was too cold to travel. But the man continued walking, following the trail that led to Henderson Creek. Eventually, he reached a frozen stream called Indian Creek. He carefully walked on the ice-covered surface, knowing this path would take him straight to his destination. As he walked, he kept an eye on the ice ahead. At one point, he suddenly stopped and stepped around a certain area. He had noticed that an underground spring was flowing beneath the ice there, making it dangerously thin. If he stepped on it, the ice could break, and he could fall into freezing water. Getting his boots wet in this brutal cold could be deadly. His feet would turn to ice, and he could freeze to death. Around noon, he decided to stop and eat his lunch. He took off his right glove, unbuttoned his jacket and shirt, and pulled out his bread and meat. This took only a few seconds, but already his fingers started to freeze. He quickly hit his hand against his leg several times until sharp pain shot through his fingers. Then, he hurriedly put his glove back on. He built a fire, starting with small pieces of wood and slowly adding larger ones. Sitting on a snow-covered log, he enjoyed the warmth while eating his lunch. After a few minutes, he stood up and continued walking along the frozen stream. Half an hour later, the accident happened. He stepped on what looked like solid snow, but suddenly, the ice cracked. His feet sank into icy water up to his knees. He cursed under his breath. This would delay him. He had to build a fire immediately to dry his boots and clothes. He gathered dry grass and wood from under a small tree, carefully stacking them on the snow. He took off his gloves again, pulled out his matches, and lit a fire. Slowly, he fed the growing flames with larger pieces of wood. He knew that at 60 degrees below zero, a man with wet feet could not afford to fail in making a fire. While he had been walking, his blood circulation had kept him warm. But now that he had stopped, the cold attacked him. His wet feet were already freezing. He could no longer feel his fingers, and even his nose was numb. The cold seemed to creep into every inch of his body. But at least his fire was burning stronger now. He was safe. As he sat by the fire, he thought about the old men in Fairbanks. They had warned him never to travel alone in the Yukon when the temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. But he had ignored them. Now, he had fallen into an accident, yet he had saved himself. He had built a fire. Those old men were weak, he thought. A real man could survive alone. His boots were covered in ice. The laces had frozen solid like steel. He needed his knife to cut them off. Leaning back against a tree, he reached into his pocket, when suddenly, disaster struck. A heavy mass of snow crashed down from the tree's branches, burying his fire. He had accidentally shaken the tree while moving. He stared at the place where his fire had been, shocked and horrified. The old man had been right. If he had a companion, he wouldn't be in danger now. The other man could have built another fire. But he was alone. He had to do it himself. He gathered more wood, but when he reached for his matches, he realized his fingers were too frozen to hold them. Desperately, he beat his hands against his legs to bring back feeling. It worked, briefly. But the moment he tried to pick up a match, the brutal cold sucked the life out of his fingers again. The matches fell into the snow. Frantic, he pulled off his gloves and gathered all the matches in both hands. He struck them against his leg. They flared up at once, and he held them to the wood. A moment later, he smelled something strange. Then, he felt it, the searing pain. His hands were burning. In shock, he opened his fingers, and the burning matches fell into the snow. The tiny flame died in a puff of gray smoke. He looked at the dog. It was watching him, waiting. An idea formed in his mind: he would kill the dog and bury his hands inside its warm body. That way, he could regain feeling in his fingers and build another fire. He called the dog. The animal sensed something was wrong and stepped back. He called again, forcing his voice to sound friendly. This time, the dog hesitated, then came closer. But when the man reached for his knife, he realized something terrible: he couldn't bend his fingers. His hands were useless. He couldn't hold the knife. He couldn't kill the dog. A wave of fear crashed over him. The fear of death. Panicked, he jumped up and began to run. Maybe running would warm him up. Maybe if he ran far enough, he would reach Henderson Creek. His friends would help him. They would save him, but something was wrong. His feet didn't feel like they were touching the ground. It was as if they weren't there at all. He stumbled, fell, and lay in the snow. A strange calm washed over him. He was no longer shivering. His body was numb, yet he felt warm. Comfortable, even. He understood now. He was dying. Well, he thought, he might as well take it like a man. There were worse ways to die. He closed his eyes and drifted into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he had ever known. The dog sat nearby, watching him. After a long time, it moved closer and sniffed the man's still body. Then, it caught the scent of death. The animal lifted its head and let out a long, sorrowful howl to the cold, black sky. Then, without hesitation, the dog turned and trotted toward Henderson Creek, toward food, toward fire, toward life.